1. When my dad was just 10 years old, he had an encounter that would haunt him for the rest of his life. It was a Friday afternoon, and he had the whole house to himself. His parents had gone to a neighbor's place for a quick visit, trusting their son would be fine alone for an hour or two. He settled on the couch, flipping through channels, enjoying the rare freedom of controlling the TV without anyone around to tell him what to watch. Just as he was getting comfortable, the TV screen suddenly went black. Confused, he clicked the power button again, and the picture returned. But only a few seconds passed before it shut off again. Frustrated, he turned it on once more, only to watch it power down as if it had a mind of its own. He thought it might just be a glitch, or maybe the remote's batteries were running low. So he stood up and started looking around for it, figuring it had to be wedged somewhere in the cushions or hidden beneath the coffee table. As he moved to the side of the couch, something caught his eye, movement, right at the edge of his vision. Turning slowly, he peered behind the couch and froze, his breath catching in his throat. There, crouched in the corner of the living room, partially obscured by shadows, was a man. He was disheveled, with wild, unkempt hair that fell over his face, and a pair of wide, bloodshot eyes staring directly at my dad. In one hand, he held the remote control, gripping it tightly, and on his face was the most unsettling grin my dad had ever seen, a crazed, twisted smile that seemed to stretch impossibly wide. For a moment, neither of them moved. My dad felt paralyzed, his mind racing with questions and fear. Who was this man? How did he get in? And why was he just sitting there, silent and smiling, as if he belonged there? 1,000 thoughts flashed through his head, each one more terrifying than the last. The man's eyes never left him, and he slowly raised a finger to his lips, as if to shush him, all while his eerie smile remained fixed in place. My dad's heart pounded so loudly he thought it might burst from his chest. Without thinking, he took a step back, hoping to quietly retreat to the front door. But the old wooden floor creaked beneath him, breaking the silence. The man's smile grew even wider, and he shifted slightly, as if getting ready to spring forward. In a burst of adrenaline, my dad bolted. He ran as fast as his legs could carry him, his small hands fumbling with the lock as he threw the door open and dashed outside. He didn't stop running, not even when he heard the echo of the man's laughter from inside the house. His voice was strange, high-pitched, and unsettling, a sound that would haunt my dad's nightmares for years to come. Screaming for help, he raced to the neighbor's house, and pounded on their door. The neighbors, alarmed by his panic, quickly called the police and rushed over with him to his house. As they cautiously entered, they found the man still there, sitting calmly on the couch, remote in hand, as if nothing had happened. His crazed smile was gone, replaced with a blank, almost serene expression. When the police arrived moments later, he didn't resist. He simply stood up, allowing himself to be handcuffed and led out of the house. The police searched him and found no identification, no personal items, nothing that could tell them who he was or how he had gotten into the house. He offered no explanation for his presence, and when questioned, he only repeated a strange phrase over and over: "Just wanted to watch something. Just wanted to watch." The officers tried to press him for more information, but he never said anything beyond those same words. Story 2 Inch. A friend of mine once shared a memory from her childhood that she could never shake. It was an ordinary day after school, one that felt as routine as any other. She was around 8 or 9 years old, used to coming home alone for a few hours until her parents returned from work. That afternoon, as she walked up the quiet street, she noticed how empty everything felt, the stillness of it, a silence so thick it seemed to blanket the world around her. Shrugging off the odd sensation, she made her way up the path to her front door. As she approached, she reached into her backpack for the spare key, prepared to unlock the door. But before she could slide the key into the lock, the door creaked open. Her mother stood there, her face pale, her eyes rimmed with a strange look of unease. Normally, her mother wouldn't be home this early, and the sight of her was as unsettling as the heavy silence outside. Her mother's face had a haunted look, something raw and unsettling, as if she had just woken from a nightmare. But it was the way her mother's gaze shifted from her daughter's face to something over her shoulder that made her blood run cold. Her mother's eyes grew wide, her face drained of all color, and she seemed frozen in place, a hand to her mouth in silent horror. Instinctively, my friend turned, her heart pounding, and there he was, a man standing at the edge of the front yard, half hidden behind a tree. He was tall and gaunt, with a long, dark coat that hung off his bony frame like a shadow. His face was pale, almost waxen, his eyes deep-set and fixed on her, unwavering, as if he'd been watching her for a long, long time. He wore a faint, twisted smile that spread slowly, widening in a way that seemed unnatural, something no human face should be able to do. She stared, frozen, feeling a chill creep up her spine as his eyes stayed locked on hers, intense, calculating. He didn't move, he didn't blink. It was as though he were studying her, committing every detail of her face to memory. For a heartbeat, the world felt eerily still, the silence pressing in from all sides as he stood there, his eerie smile never faltering. Then, she felt her mother's hand grab her shoulder, yanking her backward into the house, the door slamming shut behind them with a heavy, final thud. Her mother's hand shook as she turned every lock on the door, checking them over and over as if she feared one might somehow undo itself. Confused and frightened, my friend asked if her mother knew the man, but she just shook her head, pulling her daughter closer. They huddled in silence, every noise amplified in the stillness of the house. Outside, everything was quiet, but that didn't ease the dread filling the air. When they finally dared to check, peeking through the window, the man was gone. But at the edge of the yard, right where he had been standing, lay a single black glove, abandoned in the dirt. It was perfectly placed, as if intentionally left behind, a mark of his presence. Her mother didn't touch it, she only stared, pale and shaken, as though even the sight of it confirmed her worst fears. The days that followed were uneasy, a tension hanging in the air. The feeling that something was wrong, that he might still be watching, settled into their minds like a shadow they couldn't shake. Even small noises sent her mother into fits of checking doors and windows, making sure everything was locked and secure. Then, a week later, she found something slipped under the front door. It was a single scrap of paper with a message scrawled in untidy, almost childlike handwriting. The words read simply, "You're even prettier up close." They called the police immediately, who came to search the property, combing the yard for clues, and questioning neighbors. But there was nothing to go on. No one had seen anything unusual, and there were no fingerprints, no signs of a forced entry. Only the glove and the note, like remnants of a strange, disturbing dream. The police could do little, and in the following days, life returned to a fragile semblance of normalcy. They told themselves it was over, that he was gone. But the dread never truly lifted, especially not for her. One night, as she lay in bed, she was awoken by a faint, rhythmic tapping. At first, she thought it was just the wind, but it persisted, steady and deliberate. She lay still, her heart pounding, trying to convince herself it was nothing. But something compelled her to turn her head toward the window, and there he was. His face was inches from the glass, pale, hollow-eyed, his features sharpened by the night's shadows. He was staring at her, his mouth curled into that same eerie smile, his eyes wide, as though seeing her for the first time all over again. Slowly, he raised a finger to the glass, pressing it against the pane in a silent gesture, his smile widening further. She couldn't move, paralyzed with fear as he mouthed the word "soon" against the glass, his breath fogging the window. The twisted smile never left his face, and as she watched, he backed away into the darkness, disappearing from view. The next morning, a faint handprint remained on the glass, smudged and barely visible, a ghostly reminder of his visit. The police were called again, but he was gone without a trace, leaving only the memory of that smile, those eyes. Too afraid, their family moved away that night. But to this day, my friend still sees his face in her nightmares, and every so often, she catches herself glancing out her window, half expecting to see him there, watching, waiting, biding his time. Story 3-inch. Daniel grew up in a small, isolated town on the edge of Maine, in a house that bore silent witness to the slow unraveling of his family. His mother had struggled with addiction for years, and sudden fits of screaming marked her episodes, walls scratched in desperate claw marks, and the crashing sounds of furniture thrown about. Eventually, his parents decided it was best for her to have her own room, somewhere she could be alone during her most intense episodes, isolated from Daniel and his father for their own safety. Over time, they became accustomed to the sounds coming from her room, the haunting screams, the rhythmic banging as she hammered against the walls, the relentless scratching. It became a grim background noise, something they had both learned to live with, though they never spoke of it. But one bitter winter night, a different kind of disturbance jolted Daniel and his father from sleep. This time, the noises from his mother's room were not her usual fit of anger or desperation. They were something else, intense, sharp, and urgent. The banging was louder, faster, almost frantic, with strange scratching sounds and an odd, dragging noise that didn't belong. Daniel's father sat up, his face pale and tense, his mind whirling with questions. He grabbed his robe, and together, he and Daniel made their way down the dim hallway toward her room, their hearts pounding. As they reached her door, the noises grew more insistent, like something struggling to escape. When his father banged on the door, calling her name, the noises abruptly stopped, plunging the house into a thick silence. They waited, ears straining, before finally hearing her sleepy, confused voice from inside. When she opened the door, she looked up at them with bleary eyes, as though she had just woken from a deep sleep, completely unaware of the sounds that had filled the house. Inside the room, they were met with a chilling sight. The air was icy, colder than it should have been, as though the room were open to the winter night outside. The window stood wide open, a light snow drifting in, and the TV, usually facing the bed, was now turned toward the open window, its screen flickering with static, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance across the room. A shiver ran through Daniel as he stared at the setup. It felt wrong, unnatural, like something or someone had been watching from outside, using the window as a way to peer into their lives. Daniel's father quickly closed the window and turned off the TV, his hand trembling as he did so. He insisted that Daniel's mother sleep in their room that night, refusing to let her stay alone in the cold, unsettling room. Although she resisted at first, still half asleep and mumbling complaints, something in his eyes must have convinced her, and she finally agreed to go with them, leaving her room behind. They all settled in together, huddling in the large bed, but Daniel and his father remained wide awake, their senses on high alert. Each creak of the house, each shift in the darkness seemed amplified, their nerves stretched taut. Hours passed, and the unease settled deeper into them, thickening the air around them. Just before dawn, when they had almost convinced themselves to relax, a sound shattered the stillness, a strange, slow shuffling on the roof, directly above their room. It was the kind of noise that sent chills down your spine, deliberate and methodical, moving across the rooftop in a way that was both heavy and purposeful. Daniel's father tensed, his face drained of color, and silently reached for the old baseball bat he kept beside the bed. They sat in silence, listening as the sounds moved from one side of the roof to the other, then circled back again, hovering just above them. Then, without warning, the shuffling stopped, replaced by a dead silence that pressed down on them, thick and suffocating. That's when Daniel saw it, a single, long, unnaturally pale finger curling around the edge of the window. It moved slowly, deliberately, like something savoring the moment, its skin stretched taut and bruised, the joints knobby and thin. Another finger joined in, then another, each one wrapping around the frame, inching its way into the room. Daniel felt a paralyzing fear settle over him as he watched, unable to look away. His father, gripping the bat, was equally frozen, his knuckles white as he stared at the grotesque hand creeping into the room. Then, as if sensing their terror, the fingers slowly withdrew, vanishing back around the doorway. The shuffling resumed, faint and fading, moving across the roof until it disappeared into the distance. When dawn finally broke, they couldn't bear to stay in that house another moment. They hurriedly packed a few essentials, rousing Daniel's mother, who still seemed blissfully unaware of the events of the night. Together, they fled, leaving the house behind without a second glance. A few days later, they returned to collect their belongings, bringing a few family members along for support. The house was quiet, almost eerily so, as though it were holding its breath. They went about their task in silence, avoiding the room that had brought them so much unease, but as Daniel was helping pack up his mother's belongings, something caught his eye. Scratched into the wood of her window frame, barely visible, was a symbol, a strange, jagged marking that hadn't been there before. Beneath it, scrawled in faint, almost illegible letters, were the words, "You let me in." The sight sent a shiver through him, and he backed away, rejoining his father without a word. They locked the house behind them, leaving it to whatever presence lingered within. For years afterward, the house remained abandoned, a silent, looming figure at the edge of town. Neighbors sometimes reported strange noises in the night, soft scratching, faint shuffling sounds across the roof, even whispers that seemed to drift from the empty windows. Occasionally, someone claimed to see a shadowy figure in the window, a hand pressed against the glass, waiting, patient, as though it were still watching, waiting for someone to let it in once more. Story 4-inch. When I was 13, I had an experience I'll never forget. We had just moved to a quiet, isolated house on the outskirts of Edinburgh. It was the kind of old, creaky place that seemed to hold on to secrets. My parents loved the charm of the place, but I always felt a chill, a strange heaviness that settled in at night. My bedroom was small, tucked away in a corner of the house, with an old-fashioned, drafty window that overlooked the moors. It felt like the kind of place that had a presence of its own, one I didn't particularly want to acknowledge. One night, I woke up feeling uneasy, that strange sensation that someone is watching you. I brushed it off at first, trying to settle back into sleep, but my eyes drifted to the corner of the room near my bed. There, in the faint moonlight streaming through the window, I saw a shadow, a dark shape that seemed to stand just beyond my bedpost. I squinted, trying to make sense of it, and figured it was just my hat hanging on the chair. I'd left it there earlier, and I told myself that it was just casting an unusual shadow. I closed my eyes, determined to fall back asleep, but a strange feeling kept gnawing at me, tugging me back to wakefulness. When I opened my eyes again, the shadow seemed closer. It was subtle, but now it was near the foot of my bed. I sat up a little, blinking, telling myself it was just a trick of the light. But something didn't feel right. The shape was too tall, too solid, and it seemed to stand perfectly still, as though waiting. I reached for my water bottle on the bedside table, hoping a sip of water might calm me down. But as my hand brushed the table, I felt something unexpected. My hat. My hat was right there on the table, not on the chair where I'd assumed it was hanging. My stomach twisted with dread, and I felt my heart begin to race. The shadow couldn't be my hat. Slowly, with my breath held tight in my chest, I turned my head back to the corner. The figure was closer now, unmistakably near the edge of my bed, looming over me, silent and unmoving. I could make out a vague outline, a head, shoulders, and the impression of a face, obscured in shadow but terrifyingly present. The figure leaned in slightly, as if to get a better look at me, and that's when I realized I could see glints of eyes in the darkness. Not reflective like an animal's, but cold, dull, and fixed on me with an unsettling intensity that a scream built up inside me, but I felt frozen, unable to move, unable to tear my gaze away. My mind was racing, desperate for an explanation, but none came. It was no shadow, no trick of the light. This was a person, someone who shouldn't be there, someone watching me with an unnatural stillness that filled the room with a heavy, suffocating dread. With a surge of adrenaline, I threw myself toward the nightstand, fumbling to turn on the light. When the room flooded with brightness, I was met with the sight of a man crouched at the edge of my bed, his face barely a foot away from mine. He looked gaunt, his skin pale, almost waxy, and his eyes wide, hollow, as though he hadn't slept in days. He didn't move, just stared, a twisted smirk creeping onto his face as though he found my terror amusing. I screamed, loud and desperate, scrambling backward and bolting out of bed. I didn't look back as I tore down the hall to my parents' room, shouting for them, my voice echoing through the quiet house. My father shot out of bed, grabbing the nearest thing he could find, a heavy flashlight, and followed me back to my room, my mother close behind. My heart pounded as I clung to my mom, feeling as though I'd never be able to shake the image of that face watching me. When we got back to my room, it was empty. The air felt cold, a chill lingering as though something had left it only moments before. The window was wide open, curtains fluttering in the night breeze, though we always kept it locked. My father checked the room, looking under the bed, in the closet, even checking the hallway and the rooms nearby, but the man was gone, vanished into the night. For days, I couldn't shake the feeling of those eyes on me, that smirk, the terrible stillness of him crouched by my bed. I tried to convince myself it was over, just a horrifying nightmare that had somehow leaked into reality. But 2 nights later, I noticed something odd. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I felt something hard under my pillow. I reached under, fingers brushing against something cold and metallic. Pulling it out, I realized it was a small, rusted key, a key I had never seen before. Confused, I went to my parents, showing them the strange object. My father's face turned pale when he saw it, and he admitted that it looked like an old skeleton key, the kind used for doors that hadn't been in homes for decades. The next morning, my dad searched every inch of the house, checking each door, window, and lock, but found no use for the key. The mystery gnawed at us, and I couldn't help but feel it was somehow connected to the man, as if he had left it behind as a message, or worse, an invitation. The house felt different after that. Shadows seemed to linger a little longer, corners felt darker, and every creak of the floorboards at night sent chills down my spine. I began hearing faint whispers near my window, soft, breathy murmurs that would fade the moment I tried to make out words. One night, I awoke to find the key had returned to my nightstand, lying there as if it had never left. And on the window, pressed against the glass, was a faint handprint, smudged but unmistakable, a lingering mark of something, or someone, that had been waiting, watching, just outside, hoping to be let back in. We moved out of that house shortly after, but I can never forget that man's face, the glint of his eyes, and the weight of that rusted key in my hand, a silent reminder of the night a stranger invaded my room and left behind a secret that would follow me forever. Story 5-inch. It was supposed to be a fun getaway, a skiing trip with friends, tucked away in a remote cabin in the mountains. The isolation was part of the appeal, surrounded only by towering pine trees and miles of untouched snow. We had arrived just before a blizzard hit, the kind of storm that blankets everything in silence, turning the world outside into an endless, white void. That night, we huddled around the fireplace, swapping stories and laughing, the howling wind outside reminding us just how far from civilization we truly were. As the storm intensified, the laughter began to fade, replaced by an eerie calm as the fire crackled. One by one, my friends retired to their rooms, leaving me alone to tend the dwindling flames. The house was silent, save for the occasional gust rattling the windows. I was just about to head to bed when a loud, frantic knock shattered the quiet, echoing through the cabin that I froze, my heart pounding as I stared at the door. The cabin was isolated, miles away from any other property or ski lodge. No one should be out there in this kind of weather. For a moment, I thought it was just the wind, but the knocking continued, deliberate, steady, each rap louder and more desperate than the last. With a shaky voice, I called out, "Who's there?" But the only response was silence, the knocking abruptly ceasing. I waited, gripping the edge of my chair, wondering if I had just imagined it. But the silence only grew thicker, oppressive, and curiosity finally got the better of me. I threw on my coat and boots, grabbed a flashlight, and hesitantly opened the door. The icy wind whipped through, stinging my face as I peered into the darkness. Snowflakes swirled in the beam of my flashlight, and just beyond the porch, I saw them, footprints. They were deep and distinct, leading from the cabin and trailing off toward the edge of the property. Something compelled me to follow them, despite the uneasy feeling gnawing at my gut. I stepped out into the snow, the cold biting through my clothes as I made my way along the path of prints. They led me through the trees, past the frozen lake where the wind had swept the snow into strange, twisting patterns. The footprints were fresh, and perfectly outlined, and they seemed to move with purpose, each step spaced evenly as if whoever had left them had been in no rush to get out of the storm. But just as I reached the edge of the property, where the trees grew dense and twisted, the footprints ended. They didn't fade out or trail off, they simply stopped, as if the person had vanished into thin air. I swept the flashlight around, illuminating the shadows, but there was nothing, no one. Just the endless snow, and the wind whispering through the trees. A chill crept up my spine, and I turned back toward the cabin, moving quickly, my steps echoing loudly in the dead silence. I felt a presence, a weight behind me, as though something was watching, just out of sight. The storm seemed to close in, the swirling snow and wind growing harsher, driving me forward until I finally stumbled back onto the cabin's porch. As I locked the door behind me, a sense of relief washed over me, but it didn't last. The silence stretched on, the cabin feeling emptier, colder. Just as I was beginning to relax, the knocking returned, this time louder, more insistent, as if something were desperate to be let inside. Panicked, I woke my friends up, my voice shaking as I tried to explain what had happened. They came with me to the door, a mix of skepticism and worry in their eyes. Together, we listened as the knocking continued, relentless, but none of us dared open it. We waited, holding our breath, but when we finally threw open the door, the porch was empty, the footprints already filled in by fresh snow, leaving no trace of whoever, or whatever, had been there. We closed the door, securing every lock and retreating to the living room, huddling together in uneasy silence. But the night was far from over. Around midnight, one of my friends gasped, pointing to the window. There, pressed against the frosted glass, was the faint outline of a handprint, large and distinct, as if someone had been standing outside, watching us. We stared in horror as the handprint slowly began to fade, melting into the frost, leaving behind nothing but the empty darkness beyond. For the rest of the night, we stayed awake, too afraid to close our eyes. Every so often, we'd hear faint scratching at the door, soft, almost gentle, like something testing, waiting. By morning, the storm had calmed, and as the first light seeped through the windows, we dared to check outside. The snow around the cabin was pristine and untouched, with no sign of the footprints or the handprint on the window. It was as if the night had erased all evidence of what we'd experienced, leaving only the lingering dread and the haunting question, who, or what, had come knocking that night. Story 6-inch. Last winter, I traveled to Vermont for a job interview and stayed with my old college friend, Tom, who had recently bought a cabin deep in the woods. The place was rustic and charming, with thick silence blanketing everything, broken only by the occasional creak of the old wood. Tom called it his hidden paradise, but there was something about the place that made me uneasy, as though it held secrets in its shadowed corners. After a long day, we went out to a local tavern. By the time we returned, it was midnight and Tom, exhausted, went straight to bed. But I felt restless, too unsettled to sleep. Eventually, I went to use the bathroom. The door wouldn't latch completely, leaving a small gap between the door and the frame. As I splashed water on my face, a strange sensation prickled my skin, the feeling of being watched. My eyes drifted to the crack in the door, and I froze. Through the narrow gap, a single eye stared back at me, bloodshot and hollow. It was utterly still, fixed on me with a gaze that seemed to see right through me. I wanted to scream, but fear locked me in place. I blinked, and in that instant, the eye vanished. I tore the door open, but the hallway was empty, only thick shadows pooling in the corners. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light, but my nerves getting the better of me. I couldn't shake the image of that eye watching me from the darkness. Shaken, I headed to bed, pulling the covers up to my chin, and keeping my feet securely tucked in. But sleep wouldn't come. I lay awake, haunted by the thought of that bloodshot gaze. Just as I was beginning to fall asleep, a bone-chilling cold gripped my ankle, like a hand made of ice wrapped around my skin. I yanked my foot back, my body frozen with terror. The grip lingered, and then I heard it, a faint, raspy whisper that seemed to slither through the air, "Can you help me?" The voice was thin, con-dac, filled with a desperate plea that twisted into something darker. I bolted upright, threw off the covers, and raced down the hall to Tom's room, shaking him awake and stumbling over my words. Tom, seeing the fear in my eyes, grabbed a flashlight, and together we searched every corner of the cabin. We found nothing. Every door was locked, every window secure, and there was no sign of anyone else. But the fear didn't fade, it clung to the air like a mist, thick and unshakable. Tom decided we should call the police, who arrived quickly even though our remote location. They combed through the cabin, inspecting every room, until one officer noticed something odd in the hallway closet, a loose panel at the back. He pried it open to reveal a hidden room. Inside, slumped against the wall, was a young woman. Her body was fragile and emaciated, her clothes tattered, as though she'd been hiding there for days. Her skin was pale, her face twisted in a silent scream. I couldn't bear to look and retreated to the porch, sickened by the thought that a woman had been hiding there, watching us. Had she been a lunatic, a murderer waiting for the right moment? The thought twisted my stomach. The police searched the cabin again but found no intruders. They carried her body out in the early morning silence, leaving behind an oppressive sense of dread and unanswered questions. Later, Tom joined me outside to try and reassure me. His presence calmed me a little, and I finally told him about the eye I'd seen watching me through the bathroom door, that single, bloodshot gaze. Tom's face went pale, his eyes widening. In a shaky voice, he told me that the police had briefly examined the body. They estimated the woman had been dead for at least a week, her body partly decayed. And her eyes, they had been gone, her empty sockets staring into the void. The realization hit me like a blow to the chest. If she had been dead for days, her eyes missing all along, then whose eye had been watching me from the crack in the door? And whose voice had whispered to me, pleading for help? Story 7-inch. It was a chilly autumn night, and my friend Rachel and I were headed to a Halloween party in a town miles away from anything resembling civilization. We decided to stay at her family's cabin in Ravenwood Pines, an isolated, rustic place tucked deep within towering pine trees. Shadows cloaked the narrow road as we approached, and an unsettling quiet seemed to settle over the cabin, almost as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. The air was heavy, filled with the earthy scent of damp leaves and pine. We parked the car, quickly unloaded our things, and took a few minutes to secure the cabin. We made sure to shut the iron gate that surrounded the property and carefully locked it before leaving, just in case any stray animals, or curious strangers, decided to wander in. As we drove off, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that came over me. I glanced back through the side mirror, watching the gate disappear into the darkness. The sight of it, locked and lonely, lingered in my mind longer than it should have. The party was loud and full of laughter, an atmosphere that, for a while, allowed us to forget the eerie calm of Ravenwood Pines. Hours passed in a blur of costumes and drinks, and soon the night had faded into the early hours of the morning. As we made our way back to the cabin, exhaustion settled over us, along with the oppressive silence of the surrounding woods. The road back felt different somehow, the familiar twists and turns distorted by shadows that seemed to swallow the car's headlights. Finally, we reached the cabin's gravel driveway and slowed to a stop. It was then that we noticed it. The gate that we had carefully locked earlier was now wide open, standing ominously against the backdrop of the dark forest. The silence felt sharper, heavier, and an uneasy realization crept over us. No one should have been there, and yet, the gate had been opened by something, or someone. We left the car and approached the cabin cautiously, moving as quietly as possible. Each step we took seemed louder than the last, echoing in the dead of night. Inside, everything was cloaked in darkness. Shadows filled the corners of the room, dense and silent, as if waiting. We began to check each room, though every creak of the floorboard seemed amplified, sending chills through us as we moved through the small, empty spaces. The hall leading to the bedrooms stretched in front of us, swallowed by darkness, but something on the floor caught our attention. A single, muddy footprint marked the wooden floorboards, fresh and unmistakable. The print was large, larger than any shoe size I had ever seen, and in that moment, a cold wave of dread surged through me. We had been alone when we left, and no one should have had access to the property. Then, from one of the bedrooms at the end of the hall, a faint sound drifted through the air. It was a slow, rhythmic creaking, like the gentle sway of an old rocking chair. The sound grew louder, filling the empty cabin with a haunting resonance that sent a cold shiver down my spine. That room had been empty, completely undisturbed, when we arrived, and the realization made my blood run cold. Instinctively, we retreated back toward the door, trying to suppress the rising panic. The feeling that someone, or something, was watching us fill the air, pressing down on us with an almost suffocating weight. Just as we reached the front door, there was a loud, deliberate thud from behind. The air grew thick with an ominous silence, and something stirred in the darkness of the hallway. A tall figure loomed there, shrouded in shadow, its outline barely visible in the dim light filtering through the window. Its presence filled the narrow hall, and the chill in the room deepened. In its hand, the figure held a long, rusted chain, swinging it slowly with an eerie, deliberate rhythm. Without a second thought, we bolted out the door, adrenaline propelling us across the gravel and back to the car. The air was thick with a sense of dread as we threw ourselves into the car, locked the doors, and sped off into the night, the cabin shrinking in the rearview mirror. In the early light of dawn, we reported what happened to the local police, who assured us they would investigate. When we heard back from them later that day, they claimed to find nothing unusual. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, no chain, and the gate was closed and locked. It was as if nothing had happened at all, leaving us to question if it had been some twisted dream. But the memory of that night remains vivid, each detail burned into my mind: the open gate, the muddy footprint, and the shadowed figure with the rusted chain. We never returned to that cabin, and to this day, I can still hear the faint creaking of the rocking chair whenever I close my eyes, echoing like a chilling reminder that some things are better left alone. Story 8-inch. When I was 10, my family moved to an old house on the outskirts of town, a creaky, two-story home that seemed to wear its age in every corner. But what unsettled me most about it was the basement. Dark, damp, and always carrying a faint chill, it felt as though the basement held secrets best left undisturbed. I wasn't the only one who felt that way. My best friend, Leo, once told me he hated even looking down the stairs. One night, while my parents were out, Leo and I decided to sneak down to the basement. We wanted to prove to ourselves that there was nothing to be afraid of, that it was all just childish imagination. Armed with a flashlight, we crept down the old wooden stairs, each step creaking louder than the last. The basement felt colder than usual, the air thick and musty, almost like it was holding its breath. We walked around, joking about the old boxes and stacks of forgotten furniture, trying to keep the mood light. But then, as I turned the flashlight toward the far corner of the room, something felt wrong. The shadows seemed darker there, deeper, like they weren't just a lack of light, but something with weight and presence. Suddenly, the shadows began to shift, stretching and expanding, creeping along the walls in a way that made my stomach twist. Leo noticed it too, his face going pale as he stared. The shadows seemed to detach from the walls, forming shapes that were both human and inhuman, figures with elongated limbs and twisted faces, their mouths open as if caught mid-scream. They loomed closer, shifting, reaching. Leo grabbed my arm, his grip tight as he whispered, "Let's get out of here." But his voice was shaking, and his eyes were fixed on something just over my shoulder. I turned, and there, just inches away, was a shadow figure, its hollow eyes staring at me, empty but filled with a kind of rage that sent a chill straight to my bones. We bolted up the stairs, Leo stumbling in his rush. Just as we reached the top, the basement door slammed shut behind us, echoing through the house like a final, ominous warning. We leaned against the door, our hearts pounding, neither of us daring to speak. When my parents came home, they brushed off our story as imagination, but Leo's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear that I knew matched my own. That night, he left quickly, barely saying goodbye. Weeks passed, and Leo refused to talk about the basement. Every time I brought it up, he'd change the subject, his face tightening with an unease that reminded me of that night. Eventually, I let it go, trying to convince myself that it had all just been a trick of the shadows. But Leo had changed. He became quieter and withdrawn, barely speaking to me at school. One afternoon, he confided in me, his voice barely above a whisper. He told me that he'd started seeing shadows in his room at night, shadows that seemed to move with purpose, inching closer every time he closed his eyes. He'd see them in his dreams, two dark figures with hollow faces, their mouths stretched wide, silently screaming. I tried to reassure him, but the fear in his eyes was all too real. Then, one night, my parents went out again, leaving me alone. Despite every instinct screaming at me not to, I found myself standing in front of the basement door. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was pulling me down there, an invisible thread leading me back to the shadows. Steeling myself, I opened the door, gripping the flashlight tightly as I descended the stairs. The basement was still and silent, but the darkness seemed heavier, thicker, like it was waiting. As I stepped off the final stair, the shadows began to shift again, twisting and stretching, forming into familiar shapes. But this time, one of the figures stood out, a boy's silhouette, his features barely visible, but unmistakably familiar. My heart skipped a beat as I recognized Leo's face, his eyes wide and hollow, his mouth twisted in that same silent scream that I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight as the shadows around him grew darker, closing in like they were pulling him deeper into the darkness. I bolted up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind me, my heart racing as I leaned against it, breathless. I didn't tell my parents, didn't tell anyone. I couldn't shake the memory of Leo's face, twisted and terrified, etched into my mind. The next day, I went to school, desperate to talk to Leo, to ask him what was happening. But he wasn't there. He didn't show up the day after that, or the day after that. When I finally asked, I was told that his family had moved away without a word, leaving no forwarding address. No one knew where they'd gone, and no one seemed to care. Years passed, and I eventually moved out of that old house. But I could never shake the memory of those shadows, or of Leo's face, trapped in the darkness. To this day, I still wonder what really happened in that basement. I wonder if the shadows are still there, waiting in the silence, waiting for someone to return. And every time I see a shadow out of the corner of my eye, I feel a chill, wondering if it's him, if he's still waiting, calling me back to the darkness. Story 9-inch. In the small, fog-laden town of Black Hollow, my cousin Claire lived in a close-knit, quiet neighborhood where each resident seemed to exist within an unspoken pact of looking out for one another. Her closest neighbor, Mrs. Hensley, was an elderly widow who'd long occupied the house next door. She was a solitary figure, often seen tending to her garden or sitting by the large bay window overlooking her backyard as she knitted, framed by the dim glow of a single lamp. One autumn evening, as the sky grew dark and the town settled into its usual calm, something unusual stirred the quiet. The following day, Claire found herself haunted by a chill she couldn't quite explain. She hadn't seen Mrs. Hensley that morning as she usually did. The house next door felt oddly vacant, an emptiness pressing against the windows, even though the lights were on. Claire shrugged off her unease, attributing it to the stillness of the autumn air and the shadowy fog that lingered around the neighborhood, blanketing everything in a strange silence. But a few nights later, that unease twisted into something deeper. Claire noticed a figure standing just beyond the hedge that separated her yard from Mrs. Hensley's property. The figure was tall and motionless, almost blending into the shadowed garden, but there was something unnatural about it, an air of patience that sent a chill crawling up her spine. She stood frozen, staring out from behind her own window, trying to make sense of what she saw. The figure stood entirely still, as though it was waiting for something, or someone. The following morning, she ventured out to inspect the spot where the figure had been. The grass was flattened and lifeless, the earth beneath it strangely cold to the touch, as if it had absorbed some unearthly chill. There were no tracks leading to or away from the spot, just an isolated patch of dead grass amidst the otherwise healthy garden. The air was thick and heavy, weighted with something she couldn't name. Days passed, and Claire resumed her daily routine, though her eyes were drawn constantly toward Mrs. Hensley's house. The windows remained dark, the front porch untouched. Each night, she would glance into the yard, half hoping and half dreading that the figure would return. Yet, as though answering some silent call, it did return, always standing closer each night. It would appear in the shadows, first on the edge of the garden, then near the porch, each time shifting a little nearer, always still, always watching. One night, unable to shake the growing dread that had taken root within her, Claire lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her heart heavy with an oppressive fear. It was then that she felt it, an icy weight pressing against her, the distinct sensation of eyes watching her, though she was alone in her room. She closed her eyes, trying to steady her racing pulse, but the feeling of being watched lingered. That night, she dreamed of Mrs. Hensley, alone in a vast, empty field, her figure blurred and distant, her face a mask of frozen terror. There was no movement in the dream, no sound, only a thick, endless silence pressing down on her like a suffocating shroud. When she awoke, the first light of dawn barely breaking through her window, Claire knew she had to confront whatever was lurking in the shadows. She went to Mrs. Hensley's house, her heart pounding with each step. The front door was unlocked, creaking open to reveal an eerie silence. Inside, everything looked undisturbed, yet there was a strange disarray to the room. Mrs. Hensley's coat lay draped over a chair, one of her shoes abandoned near the door, and a half-empty teacup sat on the table, its contents long gone cold. Claire moved through the rooms, the air thick with a strange chill that seemed to cling to her skin. It was as if Mrs. Hensley had vanished mid-motion, her belongings left scattered as though she'd been compelled to flee without warning. She explored each corner of the house, but there was no sign of her neighbor, only the hollow silence that seemed to echo through the empty rooms. Days turned into weeks, and the whispers began to spread through Black Hollow. Some claimed she'd left, seeking refuge from whatever haunted her. Others spoke of darker things, hushed conversations about something lurking in the shadows of the town, something that watched, waited, and took. Since that autumn, Claire has left Black Hollow, abandoning the house with the memories that continue to haunt her. But even miles away, in the silence of night, she can still feel its presence, a cold, unseen watcher just at the edge of her vision. And sometimes, in the darkness, she swears she glimpses a figure standing outside her window, as if it had followed her, carrying with it the lingering chill of that fateful night in Black Hollow. Story 10-inch. When my Aunt Laura was a teenager, her family moved into an old, sprawling house on the outskirts of Savannah, Georgia. It was the kind of place that creaked and groaned with age, a heavy silence settling into every corner, as if it had soaked up memories from decades past. The most striking feature was the ornate mirror that hung at the end of the long hallway, a piece her parents had acquired from a small, dusty antique shop. The mirror was large, with a gilded frame and a glass surface slightly warped with age, casting strange reflections that seemed to deepen the shadows already pooling in the hallway. To Laura, it felt like a doorway, almost alive, a presence that watched over the house. Laura, an aspiring dancer, often came home from school before her parents and would spend the afternoons practicing in front of that mirror. It had the perfect height and width, capturing her movements as she twirled and spun, each step reflected back with an elegance only the mirror seemed to offer. The quietness of the hallway gave her a sense of privacy, an ideal space to lose herself in the rhythm of her routines. And for a while, it was just that, a place to dance and dream, the rest of the world falling away. But one late afternoon, as the fading sunlight filtered through the windows and cast the hallway in a soft, amber glow, something shifted. As Laura finished a spin, she caught a glimpse of something strange in the mirror, a dark figure standing just over her shoulder. Startled, she spun around to find no one there, the hallway empty and silent as usual. The shadow had vanished, leaving her heart pounding and her mind grasping for explanations. She told herself it must have been a trick of the light or perhaps the strange warping of the mirror itself, and she tried to dismiss it. Over the next few days, however, Laura felt drawn to the mirror with a strange compulsion she couldn't quite explain. She would start her dance practice as usual, but as her movements grew faster, more intricate, her gaze would drift to the mirror, seeking out that shadow. At first, she saw nothing unusual, but then, as the days passed, the figure returned, a dark, distorted shape, barely visible in the background. It seemed to linger in the depths of the reflection, as if watching her from a distance. Every time, she turned, expecting to find someone behind her, yet the hallway was always empty. The figure, though shadowy and unclear, began to feel almost familiar, like it knew her somehow. The more she saw it, the more it seemed to draw closer, its edges sharpening, its presence thickening like a dark fog seeping into the room. The air grew colder each time she practiced, and a sense of dread settled over her, an instinctive feeling that something was terribly wrong. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the hallway steeped in shadow, she saw it again, this time directly behind her reflection. It stood close enough that she could feel its presence, even if she couldn't see it outside the glass. This time, the figure was clearer. She could make out faint details, a face, sunken and hollow, with deep, empty eyes that stared back at her. Her own reflection seemed to pale next to it, like she was somehow fading. She felt the urge to move, to run, but she couldn't tear herself away from the sight. In that moment, the temperature around her dropped sharply, and she felt something cold pressed down on her shoulder. The sensation was more than just touch, it was heavy, as if it was pulling her down, drawing her toward the mirror itself. She stumbled back, breaking free from the grip, her breath shallow as she bolted down the hallway. Laura tried to avoid the mirror after that night. She stopped practicing in the hallway, opting instead to keep herself occupied in other rooms, even going out of her way to avoid looking directly at the mirror whenever she passed it. But despite her best efforts, the memory of the figure haunted her. She could still feel its gaze whenever she was alone, a silent watcher lurking just beyond her field of vision. Her parents, noticing her sudden change, asked her what had happened, but she couldn't bring herself to tell them. How could she explain something that sounded so irrational, so impossible? Months went by, and the strange occurrences seemed to fade, settling into the background like a distant memory. Laura convinced herself that it had all been a product of her imagination, a fear she'd outgrown. She even began to dance again, but never in front of that mirror. Then, one night, Laura was alone in the house, her parents gone for the evening. She wandered the hallways, her footsteps echoing in the quiet, the house seeming larger and emptier than usual. Drawn by an inexplicable pull, she found herself standing before the mirror once more. Her reflection stared back, the hallway dark behind her, the familiar details of her face distorted slightly by the aged glass. She leaned closer, curiosity mingling with a lingering sense of dread. And then, she noticed it, the faintest glimmer of movement in the depths of the mirror, as if the shadows themselves were shifting. The darkness seemed to thicken, forming a shape that slowly took on features, her own face. But it wasn't right. Her reflection began to change, her features hollowing, her eyes darkening into deep, empty sockets that stared back at her with a chilling familiarity. She felt a surge of fear as her reflection leaned forward, pressing its hand against the inside of the glass, almost as though it were trying to escape. The surface of the mirror rippled, and for a horrifying moment, Laura felt herself being pulled forward, her vision blurring as if her very essence were being drawn into the depths of the glass. She stumbled back, breaking the connection, her heart pounding as she realized that the mirror's visitor wasn't a separate presence at all, it was a twisted version of herself, a reflection that had somehow become its own entity, waiting, watching, longing to replace her. She backed away slowly, her eyes never leaving the mirror, the reflection now still but somehow darker, more sinister. From that day forward, Laura avoided all mirrors, haunted by the knowledge that something dark and twisted lurked within her own reflection, waiting for a chance to slip into her life. Even years later, she avoids her own gaze, fearful that one day, she'll look into a mirror and see that shadowy version of herself, staring back with hollow eyes, eager to take her place.